Hello, St. John's. It's a pleasure to be here with you, at least by Zoom. It's been a while since I've been down to the cathedrals. I'm sure it is the same for many of us. But I am here with you this Advent to talk about the wonderful stained glass windows from our cathedral. If you're like me, when you are in the cathedral on a bright and sunny Sunday, it's hard not to notice how exquisite, how beautiful, how radiant our windows are. St. John's Cathedral has one of the finest collections of stained glass windows in the region, and they're fascinating as well from a historical standpoint. And I want to share with you some of the stories that are represented in these windows, in particular, the nave windows, which pertain to the life of Christ. So as we mark this season of Advent beginning today, we can talk about the stories of Christ's life, which are told in our windows, which connect us back to the history of Advent and the liturgical celebration of the arrival of Christ. Our windows, first of all, are very much traditional, part of the traditions of the church and of church art. The style of the cathedral is a late English Gothic style known as Tudor Gothic. And our windows are Tudor Gothic windows. They have a depressed arch, as you can see at the top of the window, the shallow pointed arch of the late Tudor Gothic style. They are also in a style known as the perpendicular style, which is a peculiarly English Gothic style in which a lot of horizontal and vertical right angles define the aesthetic style of windows and ornamentation. So our perpendicular style Tudor Gothic windows are architecturally very much a part of the tradition of English medieval art, and thus connect us here in North Florida to the Anglican Communion and to the history of the Episcopalian and the Anglican churches, all the way back to the Middle Ages. Our window here is the first window on the left side of the nave as we face the altar. It was commissioned and installed in 1936, and it is the very first window in the narrative cycle of the images of the life of Christ, which filled the nave windows. The four nave windows, which we'll talk about in order this week and the next 3 weeks, introduce us to Christ's life from the infancy through to his early childhood and ministry to his the events surrounding his passion. And this first window is a window that treats primarily of the story of Christ's infancy. And iconographically, it connects back to a tradition of infancy cycles, that is, narrative cycles of images that tell the stories of Christ's early childhood and birth, oftentimes embroidering the actual biblical account of Christ's life with apocryphal stories that amplify and add to the narrative and the moral significance of the events of Christ's early life. That's true of our window as well. Just as in the Middle Ages, the Apocrypha and the imagination of what Christ must have been like as a child, these ideas colored the biblical events of Christ's life as people amplified and modified the biblical story through the addition of imaginative and apocryphal stories. In the center of our image, we see the events of the Nativity and the adoration of the Magi and the shepherds. And to the left and the right, in the two tall lancet windows on either side of this central event, we see additional stories, which we'll talk about in more detail. And on the bottom of the register of windows, we see a separate series of subjects of 4 saints, 2 on either side of 3 personified virtues in the center of the image. It's also down here at the bottom of the window that we find the commemoration, the memorial significance of the window, which was dedicated in honor of William Bors Drew and his wife, Frances Drew. William Drew was a member, a partner in one of Jacksonville's oldest businesses, the Drew Printing or Publishing Company, which was long located downtown in Jacksonville, and was one of the oldest and one of the most important businesses in the city. This also is very traditional. In fact, most stained glass windows like ours were given or commissioned by individuals or by groups. Oftentimes corporations or guilds or other business associations would give windows. And very frequently in Gothic windows, the bottom register of the window contains the commemoration and also often represents saints or other stories or subjects that were of special importance to the individuals who gave the window. And so our window is quite complicated. That also is traditional. Stained glass windows in Gothic churches in the Middle Ages are extremely complicated combinations of subjects and stories and commemorative details. In that sense, I always enjoy the fact when I visit the cathedral that our windows really do connect us back to a long history and tradition of church spaces, of liturgy, of memory and commemoration of members of the church. In all of these respects, the modern stained glass windows of St. John's Cathedral very much participate in the ancient traditions of medieval religious practice. We're looking here at an early stained glass window from the famous Cathedral of Chartres in France. And you can see, again, although it's a different shape here, a French Gothic window as opposed to an English Gothic window, you can see how complicated and how complex these windows really are, with large central subjects which define the character of the window, in this case, an image of the Virgin and Child, surrounded by much smaller scenes, and often down at the bottom, as I said, other scenes that refer to the commemorative function of the window and its reference to the donors. Back to the window at St. John's, we can see that this combination of subject matter is decipherable. In fact, one of the wonderful things about our windows is that they are up close to us. They're not like the windows at Chartres high on the wall, but rather right at eye level. Next time you're down at the cathedral, make sure you take time to walk through and see the windows up close, because I think we often appreciate their brilliant gem-like quality, but we don't frequently, I think, look closely to understand the significance of what is represented. They're quite profound. In our bottom register of windows, you can see here the four saints, two on either side, and the central figures of the personified virtues. Those virtues are purity, faith, and love. Now, these are not traditional virtues of the seven canonical virtues of the Middle Ages. Faith is one of the canonical virtues, but purity and love represent adaptations or modernizations of the idea of the canonical virtues. You can see that these virtues are then associated with the memory specifically of the Drew family. And that's a very interesting association that connects the family to a set of moral ideals and principles. So rather than stories or particular saints, the family members themselves are linking themselves to a set of cherished ideals and of moral and religious principles, with faith at the center. On the far left, we see the first of our saints, St. George, one of the most famous and most ancient saints of the Christian tradition, who, according to his legend, defeated a dragon, as we can see here in the painting on the left, which illustrates the story of St. George. He's often thought of as a military saint, and in that sense, he is a defender of the faith, what we think of in the Middle Ages as a milites Christi, a soldier of Christ, fighting against evil. He's flanked immediately to the right by a very different kind of saint, Saint Roch, who is a pilgrim saint and also a saint associated with the plague. You can see Roch here showing a bubo or a plague spot on his thigh to an angel who was healing it. Rock was a saint who was often prayed to by pilgrims and by those seeking healing from plague and disease. You can see our image shows him, much as in the image on the left, dressed as a pilgrim, with a pilgrim's traveling scrip and a pilgrim's staff, just as in this image. He's a traveler. So Saint Roch is a very different kind of saint, not a soldier at all, but someone who is connected to ideas of healing, of well-being, and of redemption, of penance, pilgrimage, which is a central rite of expressing our penitential desire for closeness to Christ, for the remission of sin. On the other side of the virtues, we see yet another kind of saint, in this case, a martyr saint. Saint Lawrence is one of the earliest Christian martyrs. He was martyred initially by being grilled. And in fact, you can see the grill here in the image on the left is the attribute of Saint Lawrence in our window here. He carries his grill with him. Lawrence, though, did not succumb to the grill. In fact, he mocked the people who tortured him and saying that he was done on this side, now flip me over. And they were astonished at his resilience and his imperviousness to pain. That image of Lawrence willingly suffering is a classic image of martyrdom and of the power of the martyr saints, who represent yet another type of saint. So we've seen the Milites Christi, we've seen the pilgrim or the penitential saint. Now we've seen the image of the martyr. The last of our saints, Saint Longinus, is actually sort of an apocryphal saint. He is a figure associated with the centurion in the story of the crucifixion. The centurion who pierces Christ's side with a spear while he's hanging on the cross and recognizes the divinity of Christ. He pierces Christ's side and then has a revelation and says, truly, this is the Son of God. In the Middle Ages, this centurion acquires a name, Longinus, and he is regarded then as the first convert to Christianity. He embodies, in other words, the idea of faith. He travels the world, his eyes having been opened by the sight of Christ on the cross, and spreads the message and spreads the word. You can see he's dressed here as a centurion in a similar fashion to the fellow on the left, who also wears a Roman cuirass or an armor on his chest. This sculpture of St. Longinus is actually located right here in Jacksonville, down at the Cummer Museum of Art. The next time you're down at the Cummer, perhaps, you can swing through the Baroque galleries and take a look at St. Longinus. So these four saints then represent four different types of saints. The soldier saint, or the Milites Christi, the pilgrim, or the healing saint, the martyr, and in this last case, the convert saint, the Saint Longinus figure. And I think they were probably chosen on that basis to represent four different relationships to Christ and four different relationships to the faith of the church. In the central series of images, however, we have something quite different. In this case, a narrative, the story of the life of Christ. In the center, we see the Holy Family, Joseph and Mary and Christ, at the scene of the Nativity. And to the left, the shepherds. To the right, the Magi, presenting their gifts. In the images to the left and the right of this, we see four different scenes that relate to the story of Christ's infancy. In the first image, it's the angel announcing to the shepherds that Christ is born. Hark, hark the herald angels sing, as the Christmas carol goes. In the image to the right of that, we see the Holy Family on a donkey. This is the flight to Egypt, as Joseph is commanded by an angel to take the child and his mother and to flee the wrath of Herod, who will sentence to death the young sons of Israel in his attempt to kill the Christ child. To the right of this, we see two scenes which are not entirely canonical. That is, we don't actually have a biblical text to support the first image, which represents the Holy Family at home, This is a young Christ, not an infant Christ, a Christ who's grown up a little bit, and he's kneeling before his father and mother. His father, Joseph, holds a crowbar or a tool of some kind. And the scene, again, which is not rooted in the Bible itself, reflects what we might think of as an imagination, an apocryphal notion of what Christ's childhood must have been like. A family moment where by kneeling before his father, he's representing obedience to his parents, even in spite of the fact that he is, of course, the Son of God and the King of heaven. That humility is a characteristic of Christ, of course, theologically and in the story of his life, that's brought out here in this imaginative image. On the right, we see another canonical or biblical story of Christ among the doctors. Now, this series of images is very much like the infancy or nativity cycles that were common beginning in the early Middle Ages. We see here from the 12th century the Edwin Psalter, an English psalter that depicts the Annunciation to the shepherds, the Magi seeing the Star of Bethlehem, visiting Herod. Off they go on their way, and they finally arrive and meet the Christ child, where Mary holds him in her lap, much as in our image. The Magi then return home, and we continue on to the scene of the presentation in the temple. Mary takes the child to the temple to be blessed, and on to the flight to Egypt. In this way, these kinds of infancy or nativity cycles, which are common in books of hours and psalters and stained glass windows and many other contexts, tell the stories of the life of Christ. Quite frequently, as I said, again, by adding to or embellishing the core biblical accounts of Christ's life. In addition to the four Gospels, Christ's infancy is also a discussion, subject of discussion in other apocryphal Gospels, including, for instance, the pseudo-Matthew Gospel or the proto-evangelion of James, both of which tell the story of Christ's arrival in Egypt, where, according to these apocryphal Gospels, the idols of the ancient pagans toppled from their altars as Christ entered into Egypt, representing here and symbolically the arrival of the true faith. That is represented alongside more traditional biblically based stories, such as the Nativity and the Annunciation to the shepherds and the visitation of the Magi. Back to stained glass windows, we could compare our infancy window at the cathedral to the infancy window from Chartres Cathedral, which also tells in great detail a variety of stories about the life of Christ, some of which are rooted in the canonical scriptures and some of which are based on apocryphal stories. All of this crowned at the top by the central image of the Virgin and Child. The child sits on the mother's lap, and you can see, just as in our image, Christ does not look like an infant in this image, but rather like a very well-formed and much older young man. But this is meant to be the Christ child, the infant Christ child. And the image that we're looking at is known in the Middle Ages as the sedes sapientiae, or the throne of wisdom. And Mary herself is thought of as the throne, the seat of wisdom, wisdom being Christ, Christ as wisdom personified. And in fact, that image is very much the root, the basis for our image. You can see that the way this infant Christ child stands on the mother's lap, and Mary, who faces frontally towards us, looks very much in her own way like a kind of seat, the seat of Christ's wisdom. And so this image of the mother and child in our window connects to this very ancient tradition of the representation of the mother and child. To the left and the right, the shepherds and the Magi represent the opposite sides of society. There's nothing more humble than a shepherd, nor more august than a king. And you can see there is a further variation of the figures as well that's also traditional medieval art. The first king with the long beard, the second king with the shorter beard, and the third king with no beard at all represent in some ways the ages of man, symbolically capturing not just all socioeconomic and all cultural types of people, but all ages of people, and quite frequently in the representation of the Magi or the shepherds, there will also be racial variations, as we see African figures among the Magi quite frequently in traditional representations of the story, representing the idea that Christ's arrival is an arrival not to one people, to the Jewish people, or to the Gentiles, but to all people and to the entire world. That image of the sedes sapientiae, which we find in our window and in traditional windows, contributes to the meaning of the window at St. John's in really profound ways. To the left and to the right, we have the four scenes that amplify the narrative of the infancy and turn it into an infancy cycle. The Annunciation of the shepherds and the flight to Egypt. And these are paired with a text, a quotation from Scripture, in fact. Luke 2:14, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. This is one of the most ancient and most important liturgical hymns. It is the text of the doxology, In Excelsis Deo, of the most important, the most profound hymn, the hymn connected, of course, to nativity and to the birth of the Christ child. That is a liturgical quotation in our window, which is also common in stained glass windows, as we see phylacteries and other texts inserted into the windows that contain liturgical language. To the right, we see a quotation from John 1:4. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The text begins under our apocryphal scene of Christ kneeling humbly before his parents. In him was life. That is a reference to Christ's humanity. It's a suggestion that Christ's incarnation was fully human, fully real and mundane. And that fits with the theme of the image itself, which shows him humbly, like any good, normal human child, humbly submitting to his parents and respecting their authority. The image and the text evoke Christ not just as the Son of God, but as truly a Son of Man as well. But this is married to the text underneath the image of Christ among the doctors, that he was the light of men. And this is a reference back to wisdom. Christ among the doctors is the story of Christ having been forgotten by his parents. He gets lost. They go on a trip to the temple. Mary and Joseph leave, and they look around and, well, where's Jesus? And he's lost. It's every parent's nightmare, isn't it? And so they hurry back to the temple, and they find him there among these much older, learned, serious, rabbinical doctors who are all discoursing. And Christ is teaching them, and they're sitting in rapt attention at the wisdom of this child. That image of the wisdom of Christ refers back to the central scene in our picture of the sedes sapientiae, of the throne of wisdom. So our window reminds us that Christ is both divine, but also fully human. And it's that wonderful paradox which we celebrate in Advent, and especially at the Nativity, his arrival among us as an equal, as a fellow human who will suffer and who suffers with us, but who also represents the promise of a divine wisdom and the promise of a resurrection. We can see that in the representation of Christ's life in the Middle Ages, these kinds of subjects were also common. There was both a canonical tradition representing Christ among the doctors, which is a very important story, and a more imaginative tradition of representing apocryphal or imaginative versions of the Christ child's life. This is one of my favorite pictures. It's a painting by the Renaissance artist Gerard David, which we call the Virgin and Child with Milk Soup. And it's a variation on the theme of the Virgin and Child, which is so common in art. But in this one, it represents a very human story that reminds us of just how profound Christ's humanity was and how important it is as a source of our connection to him. This represents baby's first solid food. Mary has taken some bread. You can see the bread and the apple, which are again references to sin and the Eucharistic redemption from sin. The apple, which is the apple of Eden, and the bread, which is the bread of life. She's taken some of the bread and mixed it into a bowl of soup, a little porridge. And the Christ child, of course, is practicing eating solid food. She's being weaned. Now, there's nothing more human than that. If you've been a parent, then you know the the wonderful pleasures and the wonderful messes that result from those playful experiments with eating. And you can see the child himself holds his spoon badly. He grips it, with his fist, and it's upside down. You can see him looking at it. The mystery of the spoon eludes this divine wisdom, because the Christ child is at this point fully absorbed in his own humanity in his mother's arms. A similar story, which I love. This is an image from the Hours of Catherine of Cleves, a late medieval manuscript, which represents the Holy Family at home. And it's just a snapshot of a day in the life of the Holy Family. Mary is working on her loom, and Joseph is working at his carpentry. They're both industrious and occupied and busy, doing good things, things that are morally and socially improving, work that benefits society and the family. The Christ child, meanwhile, is rolling around in his little walker because he's a toddler and he has not yet learned how to walk. Another glimpse, an imaginative glimpse of the humanity of the Christ child. He holds a speech scroll which says, "I am your solace." A story, a reference both to the way that children, of course, are our great satisfaction, our pleasure, our solace, but also in a more profound way that Christ has come as the solace to humanity. All of that is on display in our windows, our wonderful windows at St. John's, where our nativity connects us back to a tradition of commemoration of individuals, to a tradition of faith and of saints, to a tradition also of storytelling, of remembering the life of Christ. And the ways in which we remember it connect us both theologically as well as humanly to the stories, the themes of his life on earth. As we prepare to celebrate his arrival, it's a wonderful opportunity for us to reflect in our windows on the ways in which that human presence, that incarnation, has connected us through story, through art, through liturgy and celebration, to the themes of the Nativity. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to our discussion next week.